The mission was simple: survey alien flora and fauna. But when Mark Chen's ship crashed, he stumbled upon something impossible: a feral woman with the royal crest of a vanished princess tattooed on her shoulder. Years of isolation had stripped her of language and memory, leaving only instinct. Now, one human xenobiologist must undertake the most dangerous mission of his life, returning a lost heir to her throne against all odds. Mark Chen moved through the alien brush with measured steps. Each footfall tested the ground before bearing his full weight. His remaining supplies consisted of 3 ration bars, a half-empty canteen, and a damaged survival knife tucked into his belt. The wreck of his survey ship smoldered 2 clicks back, the comms unit slagged beyond repair. No rescue team would be coming. The forest of deep violet fronds towered over him, their broad leaves filtering the pale amber sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. He scanned constantly, eyes catching every flicker of movement. Packs of small 6-legged scavengers scattered at his approach, but he knew larger predators hunted here. The urgency was quiet, cold. Find water, find shelter, survive. Then a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom, too tall for the local fauna, too deliberate in its motion. It slipped between the trees with an unsettling grace, pausing as though scenting the air. Mark froze instantly. His hand went to his knife, muscles tightening into that old combat reflex he'd hoped to leave behind. It stepped into a sliver of light, a woman or something like one. Tall, wiry muscle coiled under grime-streaked skin. Her hair was a matted tangle, her feet bare and calloused like worn leather. She moved with a low, predatory crouch, head tilting as she assessed him. This was no lost colonist. This was something that belonged to the wild, a creature of instinct and sharpened survival. Every protocol screamed at him to retreat. Engage only from a distance. Observe document, do not interfere. His training was clear. Contact with unidentified life forms risked contamination, conflict, death. But as she turned slightly, a patch of cleaner skin on her shoulder caught the light. A pattern was etched there in faded ink, a design of interlocking lines and distinct angular symbols. He knew that mark. He'd pored over mission briefings during the long FTL jump, memorizing Salonan political structures, cultural touchstones, security profiles. That was no tribal tattoo or random scarring. It was the royal house crest, specifically the variant reserved for the direct heir, Princess Leandra's personal sigil. The shock was a physical jolt. The vanished princess wasn't dead. She was here, feral and alone, surviving in the very wilderness his own instruments had tagged as lethally hostile. His entire purpose on this planet shifted in that single moment. He was no longer a xenobiologist recording data. He was a witness to a living tragedy, and the only person in the galaxy who knew she was alive. He made the decision fast. His survival now meant her survival. He slowly raised his empty hands, palms out. He forced his voice to be low, steady, scraping up one of the dozen Solani words he'd been required to learn. Calm, he said. The alien word felt thick and clumsy in his mouth. Her head snapped toward the sound. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, locked onto his. She didn't flee. She didn't attack. She watched. The scientist's mission was finished. A new one had just begun, and its first fragile success hung on a single, poorly pronounced word. A low snarl rippled from her throat, a raw and guttural warning. It was a sound meant to push things away, to claim space. Mark held his ground. He kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening, but he did not retreat. His mind raced, sorting through a mental catalog of mission files, cultural briefings, and xenology texts downloaded during the journey here. He focused on the mark on her shoulder. The pigment was faded, blurred at the edges by years of sun and scar tissue, but the design was unmistakable. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a specific arrangement of 3 interlocked angular symbols, bisected by a single vertical line. The briefing imagery flashed in his mind, crisp and digital. He'd seen it on flags, on palace walls, on the uniforms of royal guards. The personal sigil of House Salona, exclusive to the direct bloodline, Princess Leandra. The name surfaced from a footnote in a security update. Her shuttle had gone down in a border skirmish a decade ago. No wreckage recovered, no body found, presumed dead. The official story was a tragic loss. The unofficial speculation ranged from assassination to defection. No one had considered this. No one could have imagined a royal heir surviving for 10 years in a Class 12 biozone, reverting to a primal state. His training as a field xenobiologist was about observation, about noticing the details others overlooked. The specific angle of a leaf, the faint chemical trail of an insect, the subtle shift in a creature's posture that signaled aggression or fear. That same hyper-focused attention now confirmed her identity. This was no coincidence, no imitation. The crest was authentic, but it was more than ink. The briefings had been clear. For the Salonan nobility, these marks were not decorative. They were a permanent record of lineage, a genetic claim etched into the skin at birth using a bioactive ink keyed to royal DNA. It was proof of bloodline, a literal key to power and the right to rule. The stability of their entire planetary government likely hinged on this one lost heir. The queen had no other children. The throne had no clear successor. A cold wave of comprehension washed over him. The scientific curiosity that had driven him his entire career was suddenly a small, distant thing. It was replaced by the crushing weight of a responsibility he had never sought. The data was clear. He was looking at a political linchpin, a living piece of history that could prevent a civil war or start one. He had two choices, both terrible. He could turn away. He could follow protocol, return to his own survival, and leave her to her feral existence. It was the safe choice, the rational one, but it meant condemning a civilization to uncertainty, leaving a queen without her child, and allowing a truth to die here in the wild. Or he could try to take her back. That path was a gauntlet of unknown perils. She was strong, fast, and unpredictable. The journey to the capital would be hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory. She might attack him, flee from him, or get them both killed. His own chance of survival, slim as it was, would plummet. He would be responsible for her life as well as his own. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, a tangible pressure. There was no third option, no middle ground. The academic observer was gone. In his place stood a man who had to make a choice that would ripple across a star system. He had to get her home. The quiet life of cataloging alien ecosystems was over. He was now an actor in a political drama he had never asked for. His stage a dangerous wilderness and his only co-star a feral princess. She watched him unmoving. Her eyes were fixed, the pupils wide and dark. It was the stare of a creature backed into a corner, sizing up a new kind of predator. She had survived here for a decade by trusting nothing, by running or fighting. He represented the unknown, and the unknown here meant death. Mark understood the math of the situation. He could not force her. A leash, a cage, a command, none of that would work. Any attempt to control her would confirm his threat. He would become just another hunter to evade or kill. Trust was the only currency that mattered now, and it had to be earned through action, not demanded. It was a fragile thing to build, and it could be shattered by a single wrong move. Every shift of his weight, every slow breath was a potential trigger. He kept his movements small and predictable. He did not look directly into her eyes for more than a second. He let his gaze drift past her, showing he was aware of the environment, not solely focused on the hunt. His own survival was a precarious balance of scarce resources and constant vigilance. His water was low. His food was almost gone. The landscape was hostile. Adding her safety to that equation seemed like a guaranteed way to get them both killed. It was a burden that doubled every risk. He spoke the Solani word again. Calm. The sound was still rough, foreign on his tongue. It felt useless against the storm of instinct and fear he saw in her. The word was a pebble thrown into a deep, dark well. He had no idea what, if anything, lay at the bottom. He thought of the briefings he'd skimmed during the flight. The official photo of Queen Zanaya, her face a mask of regal composure but with a hollow grief in her eyes that the court artists could not erase. He thought of the empty chair at state functions, the unresolved political tension her daughter's disappearance had caused. A decade of waiting. A decade of silence. His own mission parameters were clear. Observe, document, do not intervene. His personal safety was the primary directive. For a moment he considered it. He could turn, walk away, and try to reach his beacon. He could file his report on the local flora and note the interesting, feral humanoid as a curious footnote. The refusal of the call was a tangible option. It was the smart choice, the safe one. It lingered for a single breath-held second. Then it was gone. The acceptance was total. A silent vow locked into place inside him, as solid and real as the knife at his belt. This was no longer about Starfleet protocols or his own desire to see another sunrise. It was about a mother who had waited 10 years. It was about a princess who had been left behind. It was about correcting a wrong that the universe had allowed to fester. His purpose narrowed to a single unwavering point. He would see this through. He would get her home or die trying. The mission was no longer reconnaissance. He committed himself to a new role. He would be her guide through a terrain she knew only as a hunting ground. He would be her protector against dangers she understood only as prey or predator. And he would have to find a way to be her link, a living bridge back to a world of language and walls and a crown she had long forgotten. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating space. It was the first gesture of his new vow. Not to capture, but to invite. The journey began with no grand declaration. It started with a single step, then another. A slow progression into the alien wilderness. Mark moved with a careful precision, his eyes scanning the path ahead for soft ground, hidden thorns, or the subtle disturbances that marked a predator's trail. He did not look back to see if she followed. He listened. The rustle of the violet fronds was constant, but beneath it, he picked out the soft, nearly silent footfalls behind him. She was there, not following like a companion, but shadowing him like a wary animal, her instincts warring with a dawning, unfamiliar curiosity. The landscape was a constant test. The air grew thick and humid as they descended into a rocky valley, the ground turning to a sticky, clay-like mud that clung to their feet. Strange, buzzing insects swarmed in the pockets of stagnant air, drawn to the scent of sweat. Mark kept a steady pace, his movements economical. He knew this terrain was not passive. It held threats in the sinking mud pits disguised as solid ground, in the venomous spores released by crushed fungi, in the patient ambush predators that blended into the twisted root systems. Every snap of a twig under his boot was a risk. For him, it was a calculated noise. For her, it might be a trigger for flight, a signal of danger that sent her bolting back into the depths he'd just pulled her from. Ahead, the forest gave way to the roar of water. A wide, fast-moving river cut across their path, its surface churning white over hidden rocks. It was a barrier, but also a necessary guide. Following it downstream was their best chance of reaching the lower plateaus, and eventually the inhabited zones. The water was a murky green, deceptively smooth in the deeper channels but showing its strength where it rushed over the shallows. The crossing points were a scatter of dark, moss-slick stones that formed a rough, uneven bridge. He stopped at the bank and turned to her. She had halted a dozen paces back, her body tense, her nostrils flaring as she scented the water. He gestured toward the river, then to himself, and pointed at the first stable-looking rock. He kept his voice low and clear, using the few Solani words he thought might penetrate the fog of her isolation. "Follow me. Step where I step." The words were probably useless, but the intent, the gesture, was everything. He moved first, committing to the crossing. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling insistently at his legs as he waded into the shallows. The first rock was firm, the next was treacherously slick, the alien moss like wet soap under his boot. He caught his balance with a short, sharp intake of breath. One misstep here would not be a simple fall. The water would take them, smash them against the rocks, drag them under into the unknown rapids downstream. His body became a shield against the main force of the flow, trying to break the water for her. He heard a splash behind him. He didn't turn, didn't break his focus on the next step. But he saw her in his periphery. She had entered the water, her movements hesitant at first, then becoming a direct mimicry of his own. She watched his feet, his balance, the precise placement of each step. She placed her own bare feet exactly where his boots had been, finding the same firm spots on the slippery stones. A flicker of something like understanding showed in her intense focus, the animal-like attention shifting from threat assessment to learned behavior. They reached the far bank together, hauling themselves onto the wet, pebbled shore. They were both panting, soaked from the waist down, the adrenaline of the crossing slowly ebbing. Mark turned and looked at her. Water streamed from her matted hair, and she was watching the rushing water behind them with a new wariness. He said the words without thinking, a release of shared tension. "We made it." It was in his own tongue, but the meaning seemed to cross the barrier. She didn't look at him, but her posture eased a fraction. A single, fragile thread of trust had been spun across that dangerous water. The first impossible leg of the journey was behind them. The grassland stretched out before them, a vast sea of waist-high golden reeds under a stark open sky. There was no cover here, No sheltering trees or rock outcroppings. Every step felt exposed. Mark scanned the horizon in a constant, slow sweep, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. This was perfect hunting ground, but not for them. It was terrain that favored the predators who ruled the air, creatures with sharp eyes and sharper talons that could spot movement from clicks away. The wind rustled the dry grass, a lonely sound that did nothing to mask their passage. A shadow passed over them. It was swift and large, blotting out the sun for a fraction of a second. Mark froze, his head snapping up. He saw nothing but the empty blue. Then it came again, a second later, from a slightly different angle. It wasn't random. They were being circled, scanned, hunted. He squinted against the glare, his free hand shading his eyes. He counted them then, 7 dark silhouettes against the bright sun, moving with a chilling, silent coordination. They were large, with wingspans that dwarfed any bird of prey from Earth, their bodies lean and built for speed. They banked in a wide, predatory arc, positioning for a dive. The attack was not a single event, but a coordinated strike. 3 of them broke formation and dropped like stones, their dive nearly silent until the last moment. The air screamed around their folded wings. Mark had time to shout a warning, a useless sound, and throw himself to the side. He wasn't the target. The first 2 shot past him, their claws slicing empty air. The third adjusted its trajectory with impossible agility. Talons, black and curved like scimitars, raked across his shoulder and back. The pain was immediate and blinding. It was a searing fire that cut through muscle and scraped bone. Then, a split second later, a cold, venomous burn flooded the wounds, spreading through his nerves like ice. He cried out, stumbling forward into the grass. His world shrank to the fire and ice warring in his veins, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth, and the piercing shrieks of the hunters as they climbed for another pass. His vision swam. He tried to push himself up, his right arm refusing to respond properly. He could hear the beat of powerful wings closing in. This was it. He was carrion. Wounded and immobile in the open, he was a finished kill. He expected the final impact, the tearing of more flesh. But the attack on him had altered the calculus of the hunt. The feral woman had dropped into a low crouch at the first shadow, her own survival instincts screaming at her to flee, to scatter, to use the grass as cover and run until her lungs burst. That was the law of this world, prey runs. But the sight of the human going down, the scent of his blood hot on the air, triggered a different, deeper program. He was not just another creature in the wild. He was her strange, 2-legged shadow. He had shared the river crossing. He had not attacked. His presence had become a known variable in her world, a part of her new territory. And the hunters were violating it. Her survival instinct did not shift to a higher form of empathy or loyalty. It was a territorial response, sharp and pure. A threat to a pack member was a threat to the pack. Her snarl was not one of fear, but of pure defensive rage. As the lead hunter dove for the kill, she didn't run. She launched herself from the grass, not away from the threat, but directly at it. She moved with a feral grace that matched the hunter's own, a blur of matted hair and wiry muscle meeting the creature in midair. The dynamic between protector and protected shattered. In the space of that single brutal strike, the roles were erased and rewritten. She was no longer just a charge to be guarded. She was a defender. The world was a narrow tunnel of searing pain and the circling shadows of death. Mark lay half-curled in the crushed grass, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The venom from the sky hunter's talons was a cold fire spreading through his veins, locking his muscles, fogging his vision. The high-pitched shrieks of the hunters echoed above, a cruel promise of their return. He was completely incapacitated, a grounded animal waiting for the final blow. His survival, the mission, the vow, it all came down to the feral creature he had pledged to protect. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was entirely at her mercy. He saw her then, a silhouette against the bright sky standing over him. But there was no fear in her posture, no frantic energy. Her movements were not those of a panicked animal. They were sudden, sharp, and carried a shocking purpose. She dropped to her knees beside him, her focus absolute. Her eyes scanned the deep gashes across his shoulder, assessing the damage with a clinical detachment that felt utterly alien to her wild nature. This was not instinct. This was knowledge. Without hesitation, her hands went to the torn sleeve of his shirt. Her fingers, calloused and strong, gripped the fabric and ripped a long, clean strip from it. The action was precise, efficient. She wasn't tearing at it. She was harvesting it. She wadded the cloth and pressed it firmly against the worst of the wounds. her palm flat against his back. The pressure sent a fresh wave of agony through him, but her other hand came down on his uninjured shoulder, holding him in place. It was a silent, undeniable command. Stay still. Then she was gone. One moment she was there, a solid presence, and the next she had vanished into the tall golden reeds. She moved with a predator's silence, leaving no trace of her passage. The grass did not rustle. Mark was alone again, utterly vulnerable under the vast watching sky. The seconds stretched into eternities. He could hear the beat of powerful wings, the hunters still holding their position high above, waiting for a clear shot. He expected the dive at any moment, the final tearing impact. He closed his eyes, his mind clinging to the fading sensation of her hand on his shoulder. A soft rustle, closer than he expected. She reappeared as silently as she had left, materializing from the grass. Clutched in her hand was a plant he didn't recognize. It had broad, waxy leaves of a deep purple and a thick, tuberous root. Her fingers were already working, crushing the leaves and root together into a coarse, wet paste against her palm. She held her hand out, showing him the dark green pulp. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of intent he could almost understand. She made a short, guttural sound, then tapped her chest with her clean hand. "Mine," the sound seemed to say. "This is mine. This is from my world." She didn't wait for a response. She turned his head gently but firmly, her touch surprisingly sure. She applied the paste directly to the weeping wounds on his back. The effect was not instant, but it was profound. The searing, venomous pain did not vanish, but it receded, dulling into a deep, manageable throb. A cooling sensation spread from the paste, countering the invasive burn of the toxin. It was a local analgesic, an antidote, something. He let out a long, shuddering breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She watched his face, her head tilted, observing the change. She remembered. The thought was a quiet shock in his pain-fogged mind. Somewhere, buried deep beneath a decade of feral survival, was the memory of this plant, its properties, its use. The knowledge of a princess, of a healer, or simply of a native who knew the secrets of her own world, had surfaced in a moment of crisis. She had not just defended her territory, she had treated his injury. The dynamic between them had shifted on the riverbank. Now it had been shattered and remade entirely on this bloody patch of grass. The sky had turned a sickly yellow-green, and the air took on a sharp metallic tang. A distant hiss grew into a steady roar. Acid rain. Mark spotted the cave just as the first fat, burning drops began to pockmark the dusty ground. It was little more than a hollow under a jumble of moss-covered rocks and the thick, knotted roots of a massive tree. But it was deep enough. He pushed aside a hanging curtain of vines and gestured for her to go first. She slipped inside without hesitation, a creature well versed in finding shelter from the sky's wrath. He ducked in after her, the space instantly becoming cramped and dark. The storm outside was a living thing. The rain didn't fall. It sizzled and ate away at the leaves and soil, filling the small cave with the sound of constant low cooking. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet earth, damp fur, and their own sweat. The world beyond their little pocket of safety was a lethal, corrosive wash. There was nothing to do but wait it out. The silence between them, usually filled with the sounds of movement and the forest, became its own presence. It was a heavy, waiting quiet, thick with the memory of the Sky Hunter attack and the strange clinical act of healing that had followed. He broke the silence first. Not with any expectation, but just to fill the space. He spoke in a low, even tone, describing the world outside their shelter. "The rain," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It burns the skin. We have to wait." He shifted, the wound on his back pulling tight. He spoke of his ship, the sleek metal bird that had fallen from that same dangerous sky. He used simple words, painting a picture of a different kind of shelter, one that moved among the stars. Then he spoke of her home. He didn't know the word for palace or throne. He described it as it had looked in the mission briefings. "A city of crystal," he murmured. "Towers that catch the light. Your mother waits there." He kept his sentences short, his tone factual. He was talking to himself as much as to her, a monologue against the sizzling dread outside. She was watching him. Not his eyes, but his mouth. Her head was tilted to the side, her intense focus entirely on the shapes his lips made, the movement of his tongue, the expulsion of air that formed the sounds. It was the same way she had watched him cross the river, studying a complex and potentially useful action. She was not listening to the meaning. She was deciphering the code. Her own lips parted slightly as if mimicking his movements by instinct. A sound escaped her then. It was not one of her usual sounds. It wasn't the low growl of warning or the sharp whimper of pain. It was a shaped breath, a forced exhalation pushed past teeth and tongue, attempting to form a specific syllable. It was a mangled guttural attempt at the word he had just said. Rain. It was barely recognizable, more a cough than a word. The vowels distorted, the consonants soft. But it was intentional. It was an attempt. The sound hung in the close, damp air. Mark stopped talking. His own breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward slightly, a slow and careful movement in the cramped space. He didn't want to break whatever fragile thread had just been spun. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a sound meant only for the dark space between them. Yes, he said, the word full of a quiet, stunned awe. That's it. You're trying to speak. He didn't cheer. He didn't overwhelm her. He simply acknowledged the attempt for what it was, a monumental effort. The failed syllable lingered, more valuable in that moment than a full canteen of water or a functional plasma rifle. It was a crack in a dam that had held for 10 years. It was not a bridge yet, not even a path. It was the first stone placed in a cold, wide river. A single point of contact in a vast emptiness. A connection was being forged, not through shared experience or understood language, but through the patient, fragile work of one syllable at a time. The acid rain continued its sizzling fury outside, but inside the cave, a different kind of chemistry was taking place. The climb had been a brutal slog up a shale-scattered slope, the air growing thin and cold. Mark's muscles burned with a familiar, exhausted ache. His focus on the next handhold, the next stable foothold. He crested the ridge first, hauling himself onto the flat, wind-scoured stone at the top. He turned, extending a hand back for her, but she was already there, pulling herself up with a raw, effortless strength. Then she saw what lay beyond the hill, and she froze. The world fell away into a sweeping, fertile valley, and at its heart, catching the late afternoon sun, was the city. Salona. It was not a city of stone or metal, but of what looked like polished crystal and fused quartz. Spires like shards of ice pierced the sky, their facets reflecting the light in countless dazzling shards. Lower domes, smooth and opalescent, clustered around their bases like great sleeping pearls. It was the end of their journey, the glittering prize on the horizon he had described in the dark of the cave. It was real. The sight of it was a physical blow, a confirmation of every hardship, every risk taken. He looked at her. This was the moment of truth. Would it be just another strange collection of shapes to her? Another geological formation in a world full of them? A place of potential danger or curious interest, but nothing more? Or would a decade of isolation finally crack open? She stopped dead. All the coiled, restless energy that defined her, the constant low-grade tension, the alertness to every sound and scent, vanished. It was replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. Her entire body went rigid, her breathing shallow. Her feral grace was gone, leaving behind a statue carved from shock and memory. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the distant spires. They did not scan for threats or points of entry. They simply took it in. Slowly, almost mechanically, her arm came up. Her hand, usually held in loose, ready fists, uncurled. A single trembling finger extended, pointing across the vast distance toward the heart of the crystal city. It was a child's gesture, simple and pure. Her mouth worked silently. Her jaw clenched and unclenched, her lips forming shapes around words that had not been spoken in 10 years. It was a visible physical struggle, a war between a dormant mind and a reawakening soul. The muscles in her throat corded with the effort of forcing sound through a voice box long used only for growls and snarls. A rough, grating noise escaped her. It was air forced over a dry throat, torn from a place buried deep. It was unpracticed. The vowels distorted, the consonants softened by disuse. But the shape of it was clear. The intent behind it was unmistakable. It was not a question. It was a statement. A recognition. The word hung in the thin mountain air between them, more solid than the rock beneath their feet. Home. It was a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut a lifetime ago. The sound of it did not just name a place. It opened a door. Behind that door were not just memories of corridors and gardens, but of a specific chair by a window. The scent of a particular food, the sound of a familiar voice singing a lullaby. The abstract concept he had tried to describe in the cave, the idea of a mother, a throne, a duty, suddenly crystallized into a tangible reality. The destination was no longer a point on a map he was dragging her toward. It was a place she remembered. She had not just seen the city. She had recognized it. The princess had not just been found. She had begun to find herself. The journey was no longer about reaching a location. It was about a return. The gates of Shalona rose before them, not as simple doors in a wall, but as a barrier of polished crystal and cold intent. They were massive structures, two interlocking arcs of blue-veined stone that gleamed under the city's artificial suns. The guards stationed before them were cut from the same unforgiving material. They stood tall and perfectly still, their armor a darker shade of the gate's crystal, their faces impassive. The spearheads they held were not mere metal. They glowed with a faint inner light, humming with a subdued energy that promised a swift and final response to any threat. Their expressions were as cold and hard as the weapons they carried, a wall of formality and deep-seated suspicion. Mark approached slowly, with Leandra a half-step behind him. He kept his hands visible and his pace measured. He was a human, a known outlier in this system, leading a woman who looked like she had been carved from the wilderness itself. Her hair was a tangled mass. Her skin was caked with grime and old scars, and her posture was a low, wary crouch. She wore tattered remnants of his own survival gear, a stark contrast to the immaculate, gleaming city behind the guards. They were a pair of misfits arriving at the most exclusive doorstep on the planet. The lead guard took a single, precise step forward. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth or welcome, the words heavily accented but clear. "Halt, human. State your business in Shalona. The Queen does not receive humans." The statement was a dismissal and a warning rolled into one. The barrier was not just the physical gate. It was decades of cultural isolation, a history of conflict with outsiders, and a rigid protocol that viewed any unscheduled approach as a potential attack. This was not a place that welcomed surprises. Mark stopped. He planted his feet firmly, refusing to be cowed by the official tone or the humming spears. He was acutely aware of Leandra shifting nervously behind him, her instincts screaming at the confinement, the scrutiny, the potential for violence. He had to choose his next words with the care of a man disarming a live explosive. The wrong inflection, a hint of aggression or desperation, and those energy-tipped spears would become more than a threat. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and standing on the wrong side of a closed door. He did not plead. He did not explain. He asserted. His voice was low, steady, and carried the full weight of the truth he carried. It was the only currency he had, and he had to spend it wisely. "I seek an audience with Queen Zanaya." He let the title hang in the air for a breath. "I bring news of great importance to the royal house." He put a subtle emphasis on the last two words, a deliberate hook for their professional curiosity. He was not a wanderer asking for charity. He was a courier delivering a message that, by its very nature, demanded their attention. The guards did not move, but their scrutiny intensified. Their cold eyes, which had been fixed on him, the obvious threat, flickered downward to the woman half hidden behind his shoulder. They took in her feral posture, the wildness in her eyes, the way she watched them like a cornered animal watches a pack of wolves. Then their gaze snagged on her shoulder, on the patch of cleaner skin there. The faded, intricate pattern of the tattoo was just visible through the grime and the poor fit of the borrowed shirt. It was a glimpse, nothing more, but it was enough. The design was not one a human would know to fake. It was not one a savage would choose at random. The lead guard's eyes met those of the soldier beside him. A silent communication passed between them, a question and an answer contained in a microscopic tilt of the head. The formal, unyielding posture of the guards relaxed by a single, almost imperceptible degree. The lead guard gave a short, sharp nod. He did not smile. He did not welcome them. He simply stepped aside, creating a narrow path to the massive gate. "Wait here," he instructed. His voice still cold, but the refusal had been replaced by a procedural pause. The first obstacle, the most immediate physical and cultural barrier, had been passed. They were not inside yet, but they were no longer being turned away at spear point. The real challenge, the skeptical and politically charged court of Queen Zanaya, lay just beyond those gleaming crystal gates. The throne room was a chamber of cold, perfect beauty. The air was still and carried a faint, sterile scent. Light refracted through walls of polished crystal, casting sharp, clean lines across the floor. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from a single block of blue-veined quartz, was Queen Zanaya. She did not move as they entered. She was every inch a ruler, her posture rigid, her face a mask of absolute authority. Her eyes, dark and piercing, held no warmth. The grief of a decade was there, but it was buried deep, hardened into a layer of pure, unyielding skepticism. She was not a mother waiting for a miracle. She was a sovereign assessing a potential threat to her kingdom. Her gaze, when it finally left Mark, fell upon the woman beside him. It was a slow, deliberate sweep, taking in every detail. The matted hair, the grime-caked skin, the tattered clothing that was little more than rags. It lingered on the way Leandra crouched low to the ground, her body coiled tight, her eyes darting toward the exits and the armed guards. She did not look at the queen. She looked everywhere else, an animal trapped in a place of impossible angles and hard surfaces. She was a creature of the wild, and this palace was the most effective cage imaginable. The queen's voice cut through the silent room. It was not loud, but it was precise and carried the weight of absolute command. "Look at me, creature." The words were a lash, cold and sharp. Leandra flinched but did not obey. Her focus remained on the perceived threats lining the walls. The queen's expression did not change. "This is not a princess," she stated, her voice dripping with a disdain that was meant to test, to probe for any crack in this bizarre performance. "This is a wild animal wearing my daughter's form." The accusation hung in the air, a public dismissal meant for the entire court to hear. It was a declaration that this feral thing could not possibly be her lost child. Mark felt the weight of every courtier's stare shift to him. The human, the outsider who had dragged this embarrassment into their pristine hall. Their looks were not curious. They were judging, cold, and deeply suspicious. He was the architect of this potential fraud, the one who would bear the blame when this cruel joke was revealed. He stood his ground, his own posture straight, refusing to show the uncertainty that churned in his gut. He had faced down alien predators and venomous storms, but the silent condemnation of a polished court was a different kind of threat. He understood her position. A queen's hope was a luxury she could not afford. A decade of loss had not softened her. It had sharpened her into a weapon of verification. Every rumor of her daughter's survival over the years had been a fresh wound, each ending in disappointment or exposed deception. Hope was a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. To hope now in front of her entire court was to risk everything. The stability of her reign, the integrity of the royal line, the very security of the planet. It all hinged on the absolute certainty of this stranger's identity. She could not afford to hope. She could only afford the brutal, unassailable truth. She raised a hand, a small, graceful gesture that silenced the invisible murmur of the court. Her eyes remained locked on the cowering figure. "We will have a lineage test," she announced. Her voice was flat, final. The truth would not be found in behavior, in faded tattoos, or in the stories of a human outsider. It would not be swayed by desperate wishing or political necessity. The truth would be found in blood, in the immutable code written into every cell, the genetic sequence that defined the royal house of Salona. The fate of a princess and the future of an entire civilization now rested on the cold clinical results of a medical scan. The emotional reunion was over before it could begin. The Inquisition had started. The royal physician's tools were not the familiar stainless steel of a medkit. They were alien things of crystal and softly glowing filaments, unnervingly silent as he approached. The device he carried was a slender white wand, its tip shimmering with a pale blue light. It looked less like a medical instrument and more like a weapon designed to rewrite a person on a molecular level. The physician's expression was a blank slate, offering no comfort, no reassurance. The procedure was swift and impersonal. He did not ask permission. With a grip that was both firm and precise, he took Leandra's arm. She recoiled instantly, a low growl rumbling in her chest, her body tensing to fight or flee. Mark put a hand on her other shoulder, a steadying pressure. "It's all right," he murmured, the lie feeling hollow in the tense air. The physician ignored the reaction. He pressed the glowing tip of the wand against the inside of her elbow. There was no needle, no puncture, just a brief, intense hum and a flash of light so bright it left an afterimage. A single droplet of blood dark against her skin welled up and was absorbed by the wand's crystal surface. It was over in 3 seconds. Then the waiting began. The physician turned and walked to a console set into the wall, his back to them. The court fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the city's energy systems and Leandra's quick, shallow breathing. The tension was a physical weight in the room, heavy with the unspoken collective fear of a negative result. A decade of hope and grief balanced on the analysis of a single drop of blood. Mark stood beside her, a fixed point in the stillness. He did not look at the Queen. He kept his focus on Leandra, his presence a silent anchor in the storm of her fear and the court's judgment. The physician finished at the console. The humming ceased. He turned, his face still an unreadable mask. He walked back to the center of the room, stopping before the throne. He gave a short, formal bow. His voice when he spoke was flat and devoid of any emotional inflection, a stark contrast to the gravity of his words. The analysis is complete. The genetic markers of the royal house are present and authentic. The match is definitive. The statement was clinical, final. It was a fact, delivered without ceremony. It confirmed her identity in the only way that mattered to science and law. She was, by every biological measure, Princess Leandra. A collective, quiet exhalation passed through the courtiers, a release of held breath. The immediate tension broke, but it was replaced by a new, more complicated strain. Mark looked at the Queen. Her rigid posture had not changed. Her expression, that mask of cold skepticism, did not soften. There was no cry of joy, no tears of relief. Proof of lineage was one thing. It was data. It was a line of code in a sequence. Proof of fitness was another matter entirely. The creature standing in her court, dirty and wild-eyed, flinching at every slight sound, was her daughter by blood. But was she her daughter in spirit? Was this feral survivor who knew more about hunting skyhunters than court protocol, a suitable heir to a crystal throne? The Queen's gaze swept over Leandra, taking in the grime, the animal wariness, the utter lack of royal bearing. The verdict of blood was absolute. But it was only the first verdict. The creature was a princess by genetic right. But the Queen, the mother, now faced a new and more difficult test. She had to find a way to see past the feral exterior, past the decade of wilderness, and find the child she had lost. The scientific truth had been delivered. The emotional truth had yet to be written. The challenge was no longer about proving who she was. It was about helping her remember. The real work was just beginning. The bathing chambers were a world of steam and scent, a stark contrast to the dry dust and open sky. Warm, humid air carried the heavy perfume of crushed alien blossoms and cleansing oils. Polished stone basins were filled with water that shimmered with a faint internal luminescence. A ritual of purification and welcome was meant to happen here, a symbolic washing away of the wilderness. For the attendants in their crisp, clean robes, it was a familiar ceremony. For the woman they tried to guide toward the water, it was a new kind of trap. Their hands were gentle, but their touch was a violation. She recoiled from them as if burned, her body coiling into a defensive crouch against the smooth, tiled wall. A low, warning growl vibrated in her throat. The water itself, the central element of the ritual, seemed to be the source of her terror. Its unnatural stillness, its contained nature, its strange light. It was all alien and threatening. The ceremony designed to welcome her home had become a fresh source of panic, a confrontation with a claustrophobic and unfamiliar world. Mark had been waiting outside, but the sound of her distress was unmistakable. He stepped into the steamy room and took in the scene. The nervous attendants, the cowering princess, the wide gap of understanding between them. He gave a short, sharp shake of his head to the attendants. "I'll do it," he said quietly. They retreated without a word, their relief palpable. He was the bridge once more, the only familiar thing in a place of terrifying newness. He approached her slowly, his movements the same careful, predictable ones he'd used in the forest. He did not reach for her. He knelt by the largest basin, the warm water swirling with faint tendrils of color from the oils. He spoke in a soft, steady murmur, using the handful of Solani words he had practiced with her. Water, clean, safe. He cupped his hands and let the liquid run through his fingers, showing her it was just water. Then he did what the attendants could not. He guided her, not by force, but by patient example. He gently touched the back of her head, a light pressure encouraging her to lean forward over the basin. She stiffened, but she did not pull away. His other hand scooped water, letting it trickle through her matted hair. He worked slowly, his motions methodical, rinsing away years of grime and hardened sap. It was a painstaking process, a physical, act of patience that spoke louder than any words of comfort. When most of the dirt was gone, he guided her head up. The water in the basin had stilled, its surface becoming a perfect, clear mirror. He turned her gently to face it. She stared into the water, her body going completely rigid. A face looked back at her. It was a face she had not truly seen in a decade, not as a reflection. It was older, sharper, marked by sun and struggle, but undeniably her own. The features were fine-boned and elegant beneath the remaining streaks of dirt, the eyes a striking silver blue she had only ever seen in the Queen. Her hand, usually held in a ready fist, uncurled slowly. It was a hesitant, trembling movement. She reached out, not toward the water, but toward the reflection. Her fingertips touched the still surface, breaking the image into ripples. She pulled, her hand back, then lifted it to her own clean cheek, touching the skin there as if to confirm the connection. The face in the water was her face. The person in the reflection was her. A sound formed on her lips, pushed out on a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. It was not a word from a forgotten childhood, not mama or home. It was a new word for a new beginning, claimed from the wreckage of her old life. The sound was rough, unpracticed, but perfectly clear. Leandra. It was a declaration, a self-bestowed name. The princess was not just being cleansed of dirt, she was being named anew, not by a queen or a court, but by herself. The feral survivor was choosing to become Leandra again. They returned to the throne room. The clean lines and scents of the cleansing chambers fell away, replaced once more by the cold, watchful silence of the court. Leandra was no longer a creature of the wild, but she was not yet a princess of the court. She wore the royal garments now, a flowing tunic and trousers of a soft gray-blue fabric, but they hung on her wiry frame like a borrowed skin. The fabric felt alien against her skin, the cut restrictive. She moved with a new unease, a self-conscious stiffness that was almost worse than her feral crouch. She kept close to Mark's side, her shoulder nearly touching his arm, drawing a thin line of comfort from his familiar presence in the vast, unfamiliar space. The Queen watched from her throne. The mask of cold authority was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over a hope so fragile it seemed it might shatter at a sound. Her hands, resting on the arms of the throne, were perfectly still, but the knuckles were white. The genetic test had provided the fact of her daughter's return. This moment would provide the truth of it. The entire court watched with her, their collective gaze a heavy pressure. They expected a performance. They needed proof that their vanished princess had not just returned in body, but in spirit, that she was whole, that she remembered the weight of the crown, that she could be their heir. Leandra stood in the center of the room, exposed. Her eyes, no longer wild with animal fear, were now wide with a different kind of terror, the fear of a stranger in a place she should call home. She did not look at the assembled nobles or the stern-faced guards. Her gaze was fixed somewhere on the polished floor, her body angled subtly toward Mark, that single point of stability in a tilting world. The Queen spoke. Her voice was different. The cutting edge of skepticism was gone, filed away by the verdict of blood. What remained was quieter, layered with a tension that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with a mother's desperate, decade-long need. "Do you know this place?" she asked. The question was simple, its answer a mere formality for anyone else. For the woman standing before her, it was a mountain to climb. Leandra's mouth moved. It was a dry, soundless working of her lips and jaw. The court held its breath. The silence stretched, so complete they could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the crystal walls. Then a sound emerged. It was rough, pushed out from a place of immense effort. It was a single Solani word, the affirmative. Yes, it was clear, unmistakable. The Queen's breath caught. A flicker of something, relief, pain, a desperate joy, passed over her face so quickly it was almost not there. She leaned forward slightly, a minute breaking of her regal posture. Her next question was softer, the words barely more than a whisper that carried through the silent hall. "Do you know me?" This was the harder word. It was not a question of geography or memory. It was a question of the heart, drawn from a deep well of a past life. Leandra's eyes lifted from the floor. They traveled up the queen's robes over her still hands, finally meeting her gaze. The woman on the throne was not just a ruler. She was a face from a dream, a scent from a childhood, a feeling of safety that had been lost for 10 long years. Her lips parted again. The sound that came out was not a snarl or a growl. It was a word, older than yes, simpler than queen, drawn from a time before speeches and protocols and crystal thrones. Mama. The title hung in the air between them, a single breathed syllable. It was not loud. It did not echo. But it was absolute. It did not need a genetic test for verification. It was a truth that went deeper than blood. The word did not just name a relationship. It dissolved the distance of a decade. It shattered the queen's composure. The regal mask crumbled away, revealing the raw, grieving mother who had waited every single day for this sound. The cold throne room, for a single, suspended moment, held only the warmth of that one word. The queen's composure did not shatter. It softened, the rigid lines of regal authority melting into a different kind of strength. The cold mask of the sovereign was gone. In its place was the face of a woman who had carried a decade of grief and could finally set it down. She looked from her daughter, who stood with a new, fragile awareness, to the human who had made this moment possible. Her gaze held a depth of gratitude that went beyond words, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. The entire court watched this exchange. The air in the throne room, which had been thick with judgment and political tension, now held a different charge. They had witnessed the impossible, the return of their lost heir. Now they waited to see how their queen would handle the outsider, the human who had walked out of the wilderness with their princess in tow. Would he be dismissed with a reward, tolerated as a curious anomaly, or granted a place in this new chapter of their history? His treatment would set a precedent, signaling the court's stance on the unknown, on the outside universe he represented. The queen straightened. The moment of softness passed, replaced by a formal dignity. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and carried the full weight of her office. It echoed off the crystal walls, a pronouncement for all to hear. Mark Chen of Earth. She spoke his name with a deliberate gravity, making him a fixture in the official record of her reign. You are hereby granted the status of royal friend, the highest honor we can bestow upon a non-Zalani. The title landed in the silent hall. It was not a medal or a chest of treasure. It was a political appointment, a formal recognition that wove him into the fabric of their society. He was no longer just a visitor or a temporary savior. He was a bridge, a permanent link of trust between their species. His actions had earned him a unique status, one that came with rights, responsibilities, and an unassailable place in their world. It was a strategic decision as much as a grateful one, an offer of alliance built on proven loyalty. You have done what none of our search parties could achieve. Her words were simple, factual. They carried no embellishment, no dramatic flair. They were a stark acknowledgement of a simple, staggering truth. For 12 years, the full military and technological might of the Solani civilization had failed. Squadrons of scouts, teams of trackers, advanced sensor sweeps, all had turned up nothing but dust and dead ends. One man, armed with nothing but stubborn compassion and a sharp eye, had succeeded where an empire had failed. The statement honored him by highlighting the sheer scale of his accomplishment against their collective failure. For Mark, the words were a physical release. The acknowledgement was a weight lifting from his shoulders, a tension he had carried since the moment he first saw that faded crest in the forest. The mission, undertaken on a desperate vow, was now complete. It had ended not just with survival, but with a success that had surpassed every possible parameter. The pressure of being solely responsible for a princess and a planet's future dissolved, replaced by the solid ground of formal recognition. His role was no longer that of a savior operating outside any structure. That chapter was closed. He was now an ally, a recognized entity within the Solonan political framework. His place in this world, which had been so precarious and temporary, was now formalized, etched into their laws and their history. He had a standing, a title, and a voice that would be heard. The lone xenobiologist who had crashed on a routine survey mission was gone. In his place stood a man whose name would be recorded in Salonan annals, a permanent part of their story. He was no longer an observer of alien ecosystems. He was now a key figure within one, a human thread permanently woven into the tapestry of a civilization light years from his own. The honor was not an ending. It was the first step on a new, uncharted path. The ceremony ended. The formal pronouncements were complete. The courtiers began to drift away in small murmuring groups, their polished boots whispering on the crystal floor. Mark stood where the Queen had left him, the new weight of his title resting on his shoulders. The space around him felt vast and empty. He was an anchor point in a sea of unfamiliar protocol and unspoken rules. His purpose, which had been so clear and direct for weeks, move, survive, protect, was now gone. He was adrift in the quiet aftermath, unsure of his next move in this new formal world. The bond forged in the mud and blood of the wilderness now had to find its footing on polished floors. The tension was a subtle shift. The immediate dangers were past. The sky hunters, the acid rain, the suspicion at the gate, those were concrete threats he knew how to face. This was different. It was the quiet pressure of a society watching, of a relationship built in extremis now having to exist in a place of order and expectation. The survival partnership had to become something else. Something that could live inside walls. Then she approached. Not the feral creature from the forest and not the stiff, uncertain figure in royal robes from moments before. This was Princess Leandra. She moved with a new awareness, a sense of her own space within the grand hall. She stopped before him, her silver blue eyes holding his. Those eyes were different. They were clear now, free of the animal fear. But they were not the soft eyes of a courtier. They held the hard-won wisdom of the wild. The patient focus of a hunter, layered over a dawning recognition of her royal self. She was a fusion of both worlds, and her gaze acknowledged him as a part of each. She did not speak. She raised her hand, her movements sure and deliberate. She placed her palm flat against his chest over his heart. It was a gesture from their journey. In the cave, after the sky hunter attack, it had been a command to stay still while she tended his wounds. On the treacherous river crossing, it had been a point of balance. It was their language, a wordless signal of trust and connection forged when words were impossible. The touch was firm, real. It was an anchor in the strange new reality of the court. She held her hand there for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. She was measuring the beat of his heart, a rhythm she had listened for during cold nights on the trail. It was a silent reaffirmation of everything they had been through. Then her hand lowered. She took a small breath, the air catching slightly as it moved through a throat still learning its old voice again. When she spoke, the sound was clearer than it had been before. The roughness was still there, a gravelly echo of her years of silence, but the words were shaped with a new certainty. She did not use his new title. She did not use the flowery language of the court. She used the two words that mattered, the two names that defined their entire shared history. She claimed a new word for the bond that stood between them. A word that belonged to neither the wild nor the palace, but to the path they had walked together. Mark. A statement of fact. His name, then the new word, the chosen one. Friend. The word landed between them with the weight of a contract signed in shared blood. It was a summary of the entire journey, from the first moment in the violet forest to this polished hall. It was a promise unbreakable and simple for whatever future lay ahead. It acknowledged the risks taken, the miles traveled, the silent vows made in the dark. It was the final necessary payoff. It was not a reward given by a queen, but a truth offered by a partner. The feral survivor and the lone scientist were gone. What remained were two friends, standing together in the quiet of a crystal hall, their bond now spoken aloud and made permanent. In the quiet aftermath, the full scope of the journey settled. The adrenaline faded, leaving the memory of each step, each danger, each choice. The mission's success could be measured in the reclaimed palace throne and the mended royal line, but its true engine was a far simpler, more stubborn thing. It was not technology that accomplished this. His wrecked ship was scrap. His gear was basic survival issue. It was not superior strength. The Solani guards were larger, their weapons far more advanced. His own body was battered, pushed far past its limits. Their entire civilization, with its crystal cities and fleets of scouts, had failed for a decade where one man had finally succeeded. The difference was not in hardware or muscle. It was a quality his host had likely dismissed in humans, a kind of stubborn, illogical compassion. A xenobiologist's trained curiosity was the first spark. He saw the royal crest not as a political symbol, but as a detail that broke the natural order. That analytical observation was the seed, but that seed grew into a guardian's resolve. It was a shift in purpose, a silent vow made in a hostile forest. He chose to protect, not just to observe. He chose to intervene in a story that was not his own. This was not a calculated political move. It was a human response to a witnessed tragedy. The journey was a long exercise in patience overriding instinct. Her every impulse was to flee, to fight, to distrust. His response was a steady, quiet presence. He moved with deliberate care. He spoke calm words into a void of understanding. He waded through her panic, her silence, her fear. This patience was a form of empathy in action. It was an attempt to bridge a gap not just of culture, but of years lived in a different reality. He did not try to force her back into her old shape. He simply walked beside her, allowing the new one to form. He saw a person where others saw only a beast. The Solani guards at the gate saw a wild animal. The court saw a feral impostor. Even the queen in her deepest grief saw a creature wearing her daughter's skin. He saw past the grime and the snarls. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the careful observation, the flicker of memory fighting its way to the surface. He also saw a queen where others might see only a victim. He understood that Queen Zanaya's coldness was not a lack of love, but a defense against a decade of false hope. He navigated her court not with aggression, but with a respect for the weight of her loss and her position. This human element, the simple, illogical refusal to abandon a lost soul is what fundamentally changed their world. It was not a grand strategy or a display of power. It was the decision made again and again to not turn away, to share water, to stand guard, to apply a healing paste, to speak a quiet word in the dark. These small acts of connection, repeated over hundreds of miles, accomplished what fleets and search parties could not. They rebuilt a person and, in doing so, altered the future of a planet. It proved a simple, powerful truth about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. He felt fear on the river, under the shadow of the sky hunters, standing before the Queen's judgment. It was a cold, constant companion. Courage is the conscious choice to act despite that fear. It is the decision to step onto the slippery rock, to face the diving predator, to speak truth to power, because the alternative, inaction, is a greater failure. His entire journey was a series of those choices. The greatest alien technology encountered was not the gleaming city or the energy spears. It was not the genetic scanner or the luminous baths. The most powerful force witnessed was a far more common one. It was the human capacity for connection, the ability to look at a stranger, to see their suffering, and to feel a responsibility to help. This capacity forged a bond across a chasm of experience and biology that no machine could ever hope to cross. The story is a testament to that simple, powerful truth. It is a reminder that history is often changed not by the loudest voice or the strongest arm, but by the quiet resolve to see a thing through, to hold on, to bring someone home. The mission that began with a ship's crash ended with a dynasty's repair. A broken line was mended not by armies but by a single choice to not look away. Remember that the most impossible quests start there, with that first refusal to ignore suffering. The universe is vast, cold, and filled with unknowable dangers, but its history is not written by those dangers. It is written in the smaller, quieter stories. It is written in the stubborn acts of courage, the quiet bonds of loyalty, and the long, difficult road of coming home.